This summer has been a season of strikes, from Hollywood writers and actors to the auto workers at the Big Three. Some of the country's largest unions have walked off the job, and the latest group attempting to organize is Wells Fargo bank employees. Joining me tonight is Wayne State Professor of Management and union expert Marick Masters. Marick, thanks so much for joining me today.
Pleasure to be here.
So what do you think it is about this particular moment in history that has so many unions standing up and others attempting to unionize?
Well, I think people see the opportunity that unions provide to have a collective voice. Their voice alone isn't enough to get management attention often unless they're an elite performer in an elite industry. And for most of us, we operate at the whim of management. And this provides them with an opportunity to make certain that under the laws, they get their voice heard if they're represented. And also people have a right to seek that representation, which they're doing at Wells Fargo.
We have had a strong labor market with relatively low unemployment for some time now, barring some sort of strangeness with the pandemic. What role does that play in this resurgence of unions?
Well, I think it gives people confidence. They're willing to take more risks. But also, I think the pandemic made them realize their vulnerability, and also how at much mercy they were at what employers would do to them when they were in the midst of a health crisis. So they went to work not knowing whether they'd be going to work the next day, how their employers would treat them, whether they'd bring them back, whether they'd compensate them for time off. So all those things caused them to take pause and say, maybe we ought to rethink how we get our voices heard in the workplace.
Is there somewhat of a contagion factor? If you see more unions rising up, does that inspire others to do the same?
Well, yes, it's almost like a tipping point that people, they come to realize that it's that epiphany, that moment in which you realize that, hey, if we get together, we can do so much more than we can individually. And maybe there is a rationale for joining a union, and we ought to give it a careful look.
So when it comes to the UAW, for one, if they are successful in getting some or all of their demands, what kind of message does that send to some of the other auto workers in the country who are not unionized?
Well, it's going to send a clear message that there is value in joining in a union. And I think that they realize the importance of that. If they don't get a good contract, it's going to be hard for them to go to the workers of Tesla and hard for them to go to the workers at the foreign transplant, so to speak, and make their case. People are going to say, well, you went out on strike, all the workers suffered, you've got this scandal in your history, why should we join you? But if they're successful, if they get a high pay raise and otherwise well represent their members, then people will give them another hard look and say, maybe this is something we ought to do here.
Are there other moments we can look to in history that were similar, in which unions did seem to collectively be more powerful?
Well, I think in the 1930s, there was clearly a time, you know, the founding of the UAW is a case in point in which people realized that there is power. The sit-down strike telegraphed the potential power of unions to represent workers and the good that they could do. And I think that catapulted the growth of the United Auto Workers, which took off after that.
Now, if there's an ebb and flow, what causes it to move in the other direction? Why have we not heard as much of this until the last couple of years?
Well, I think you've seen a combination of structural forces in the economy. International competition is one. The growth of non-union jobs in the service sector, the Wells Fargos, if you will, of the world. Those kinds of structural changes have made it very difficult, and also the legal climate is difficult for unions because employers are very adept at resisting unions. I'm also a management consultant part-time, and I can tell you that I have never encountered a single manager in private say that they welcome a union.
So what does that say about the future of organized labor in this country?
It's going to be a fight. It always has been a fight. And employers, you can count, will spend a lot of money and go to great lengths to resist a union. I'm not saying they're violating the law. They'll do everything that they can within the ambit of the law, but the ambit of the law gives them a lot of discretion in terms of how to resist unions. It makes it very difficult for workers to overcome if employers want to stop them.
Sure. Does this seem like a time to strike while the iron's hot for other employees who are not unionized yet?
Well, I think this is clearly an opportunity. And if unions are savvy about it, they'll take advantage of it. I think part of the problem that unions have had over the years is that they've been complacent and they haven't been smart in how they've approached organizing. They used a top-heavy, top-down approach to organizing, and that doesn't resonate well because the workers begin to think the union is probably going to be just as bad as management.
Now, we've seen that change a little bit, the UAW being a perfect example, right? Shawn Fain sort of seen as an insurgent.
He is an insurgent.
Yeah.
And he was elected on the heels of a scandal, and that puts him in a difficult spot because he promised to be more transparent, and there are pluses and minuses to being transparent. You raise expectations, and you have a lot to deliver. His leadership is on the line very much as anybody else's right now. And so he's got a lot at stake, but if you don't make take these kinds of risks at this moment in time, then you never will. And so this, I think, is a telling point, and labor has an opportunity. I think one thing I give to Shawn Fain that is really critical, he's changed the narrative. But we weren't talking about wages, what's a just amount of wages for workers, how should we try and reorient the equation to where workers get more and they recoup the losses of the past. We're talking about that now, and that's because of their activity, as well as other unions like the Teamsters that got a good contract, and the writers and screen actors that are struggling. That's a whole different industry with a whole different set of dynamics, but the same forces are operating. Workers are trying to get a place at the table.
Yeah, we're in this very interesting moment in history where there are a lot of technological changes, and that's coming up in a lot of these conversations, from Hollywood and the future of AI to the transition to electric vehicles in the auto industry. Is that par for the course in organized labor organizations, just sort of battling up against technology and major changes?
Yes. If you look at the literature that the United Auto Workers produced in the 1950s, they were focused very much on technology and what it would do to their jobs. Nothing has changed except the pace of change. It is much more accelerated than it was in the past. And as a result of that, things like AI, which you never could have imagined 2 or 3 decades ago, is now a potential threat to a lot of different jobs, including the job that I have as a professor. I mean, you could get an avatar with the right intelligence algorithms programmed, and they could probably teach a pretty good class.
Well, we still need you. I think we're all in a similar boat there. Do you see any generational difference in how unions are viewed?
Yes, I see the younger generation, the Generation Z, and the millennials, but particularly Generation Z, I see them having a more positive attitude. They've seen their parents struggle so much with the workplace and jobs and the precariousness of life. And they realize that, they're looking at the situation and they're thinking, what kind of retirement am I going to have? Am I going to be able to buy a home? Am I going to be able to provide for a family if I choose to want a family? All those things, I think, are uppermost in their mind, and they're thinking, well, maybe I'd like to buy an EV, but I don't know if I can afford it. Right. And when the average income of a purchaser of a Tesla Y is about $150,000, that tells you where most people are.
Yeah, not the average income in the country.
No.
Far from it. All right, Professor Marick Masters from Wayne State University, you've lent us your expertise so much over these past few weeks.
Oh, it's been my pleasure.
We do appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Marick.